All right, Daniel chapter 5, if you have your Bibles, be opening there. Whenever you study the Scriptures, you're going to find that many different forms of teaching have been employed. We're obviously very familiar with parables, especially the parables that Christ taught while here on this earth. Even miracles themselves, miracles performed by Christ, miracles performed by the apostles, even the miracles of the Old Testament, well, they were designed to teach valuable lessons. They were not just performed for random purposes. They were designed for specific purposes, to teach valuable lessons and to bring people into faith. And you also see other forms of object lessons, and that's what we're going to see this morning. Perhaps there is no more frightening and sobering object lesson to be studied in God's Word than the events that are recorded for us in Daniel chapter 5 and the miraculous occurrence of the fingers writing on the wall. Question: how would you feel? What would your first reaction be if out of nowhere you saw a disembodied hand writing something on the wall? What would your reaction be? I'd probably be pretty frightened, terrified. Would that be your reaction as well? However, though, in our haste to focus on the miracle itself, we forget the significance of the words that these fingers penned and what they mean. In Daniel 5, verse 27, Daniel, in explaining what these words meant to King Belshazzar, here we have one of the most important biblical principles in the Bible. Daniel tells Belshazzar that thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. In other words, the king was placed on the divine scales of God's righteous judgment and was found lacking. Now, why was Belshazzar lacking? Why was he found wanting? What wasn't there that God expected to find?
Himself,
God. He had completely left God out of the picture, had he not, Brother Ricky? As we're going to further study. And as such, Belshazzar was going to pay a heavy price. A study of this scripture is vital, I believe, to understanding that God's judgments are just. They are righteous. But not only are they right, they are just. Does God make a mistake when He judges people? And why is that? How do we know that God's judgments are mistake-free, are perfect? That is, they are just and righteous. Would it not be because of who God is? He is perfect. He makes no mistakes whatsoever. And so that when we study this section of Scripture, I think one of the lessons we're going to find and what it's going to demonstrate to us is that come Judgment Day, come that day of judgment when Christ comes again, when the dead are raised from the grave, and when we stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and when men receive the sentence to depart from me, is it going to be a mistake on God's part? No, it's not going to be a mistake on God's part. But rather, why will men receive that sentence? Why will it be the case on the day of judgment that men will hear the words, "Depart from me"? Their own doing. And so in our study, as we think about this principle, we're going to examine the text. We're going to discuss it briefly. Then we're going to derive some practical applications from the text as it applies to the principle of being weighed in the balances and being found wanting. That is, the conduct that will cause individuals to be in such a condition. So, as we look at the text, verses 1 through 4, we find the foolish behavior, and we won't take the time to read all of these verses. We will read a few here and there. But you look at verses 1 and 2, what kind of a feast did Belshazzar make? And these 4 verses record for us the foolish behavior of the king. What do we learn from these first 2 verses? What were they doing? What had the king made? A drunken feast. Now, was there anything wrong with the feast, having a feast? No. Now, where's the problem come in?
Who he's giving praise to.
What's that?
Who he's worshiping. The Lord's.
Exactly, Brother Ricky. We'll get more into that. So who he was praising, who he was worshiping was a problem. But what also was a problem according to the first two verses? It wasn't that he was just having a feast. He was a drunken feast. You know, it's the drunken debauchery that is the problem. And again, look at the order of events here. First you have the feast, then comes the drunkenness. And it's interesting to note that when you look at this, the idea conveyed here is that of a drinking contest.
Well, they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
They were drinking out of those.
Indeed, they were. And they were, as we're going to see here in just a moment. We're going to see the significance of that. And so here you have these individuals, these powerful individuals, you know, this drunken feast. And what kind of behavior does alcoholic beverages lead to? What happens if you get drunk and you get behind the wheel of a car? What's going to happen? You're going to get in trouble. Proverbs 20 verse 1 teaches us that wine is a what? It's a mocker. Now, why does it mock? Why does it mock? Let's ask this question. Why does it mock man? Any ideas?
Because it impairs the judgment.
Impairs the judgment. And does it not, and you're exactly right, Sister Gail, does it not lead men to engage in irrational and irresponsible behavior? And with Belshazzar, it led him to act in further irreverently toward God. Look at verses 2 through 4 as well. Not only did he have his kings, his princes, he brought in his wives, his concubines, to add to the debauchery and to the degeneracy. But as Sister Gail pointed out, not content with just imbibing the wine from any container, what does Belshazzar call for? He's not just wanting to drink it from his own royal containers. What does he want to? What does he do now? The vessels from the temple, the gold and silver vessels. Now they were brought by Nebuchadnezzar from the temple, and these vessels had been dedicated to service in the holy places of Jehovah's temple. But they were brought to Babylon when the city of Jerusalem and the temple itself was destroyed. When Nebuchadnezzar brought them to Babylon, he placed them in the temple of his god, which was Marduk. You go back to chapter 1 and you read this from verse number 2. Would we be wrong in saying that Nebuchadnezzar showed more respect for these vessels than Belshazzar did? Because what did Nebuchadnezzar do that Belshazzar didn't? Where he had him placed. We understand he had him placed in the temple of a false god, which is no god, but yet he refused to use them for any other purpose than a sacred purpose. Are we correct? But what does Belshazzar decide to do? He decides to use these vessels. And but not only that. He uses these vessels, and he does what in the same? While they're drinking, he praises whom, as you pointed out, Brother Ricky? Different gods, and they are made up. And here they're not specified, but we're told that they are made up of silver, of gold, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So he was praising a whole host of gods, was he not? Rather than the God of heaven. So the consequence, I believe, of such a spirit of irreverence and profaning of the holy things of God should be a warning to us all. Again, with the praising of these false gods by using these vessels and drinking, it showed further contempt for Jehovah God. Would we also say, as we consider these verses, was Belshazzar mocking the God of heaven? What was he trying to say? What do you think he was trying to say about the God of heaven by these actions? Let's ask this question.
It wasn't important to him.
What's that?
God wasn't important to him.
No, or it's not important to him, or these are my gods, I don't need you. You're not worthy of my adoration. So he was mocking God. And what did Paul write in Galatians chapter 6 regarding mocking God? Is God mocked? Really? No. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. And so Belshazzar had deceived himself if he thought he could, and if he could get away with such actions. Did he not? And so, you remember the principle that found in the book of Numbers, be sure your sins will find you out. And well, here in just a moment, we're going to see that Belshazzar's sins did find him out. So what happens in verse number 5? In that same hour did what?
Saw a human hand writing on the wall.
Came forth the fingers of a man's hand. Now, this was just a hand, was it not? The fingers? A disembodied hand. And it wrote on the plastered wall behind the candlestick. So this was where the king could easily see it, was it not? This thing was not done in a corner. This thing was open knowledge, according to verse 5. Now, when the king saw it, how did he react, according to verse 6? What was the king's reaction to this event? To seeing these fingers, just this hand appear out of nowhere and write on the wall. What did this do to Belshazzar? There you go. Scared him to death. Can you get the picture here? That is, he's just trembling and his knees are clattering against himself. And again, this is a king, this is a king. He was so fearful, his knees, as Brother Ricky put it, were a knocking. He was quavering. He was quaking with fear. And so what did he do? What was his plea in verse number 7? What did he want done? And again, this sort of reminds you of the actions of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar when he had his dreams. So like Nebuchadnezzar initially, what does Belshazzar decide to do? Who does he send for? The wise men of Babylon. And he asked them to read what was wrote and what it meant. And what happened in verse number 8? What was it that, like with the events of Nebuchadnezzar, what was it that they could not do for Belshazzar? Sorry, king, we don't know. We see the writing, but we cannot interpret it. We have no idea what's going on. And again, it was futile to trust in men. They couldn't do it. Their failure to do such left them in a state of confusion and suspension. In fact, Belshazzar was agitated and disturbed by this turn of events. Even the lords there were astonished. They were perplexed and upset and tumultuous. So by this time, would you not say that there was a spectacle going on in the feast area? Would there not be? With all the murmuring, do you suppose there was shouting going on in all of this? I would say so. It was a tumult. So look at verses 10 through 12. The queen heard all of this, and she heard the confusion. Now here she enters the scene. And she tells Belshazzar to be not troubled. Now why does she tell Belshazzar to not be troubled? She seems to have confidence. Why did the queen have confidence? Why did she tell Belshazzar not to be troubled? What did she know that Belshazzar refused to acknowledge?
She knew about Daniel and how he helped Nebuchadnezzar and that he could interpret.
Exactly. You're exactly right, Sister Gail. And she further describes the character of this man, in whom his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had trusted. And so she advises Belshazzar, you need to call for Daniel. And he could show you the interpretation. And certainly she showed complete confidence in Daniel, did she not? So Belshazzar does call for Daniel. Verse 13, we have the conversation between the two. And he asks him, art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and this is what he recognized, in that light and understanding and exceeding excellent wisdom is found in thee. What he knew also, as he's discussing with Daniel, is that his own men couldn't interpret the dream or the writing, and that only Daniel could. Now, look at verse 16. What promise does he make to Daniel if he can interpret this writing on the wall for him?
All the gifts that give him.
He's going to lavish him with gifts and also make him the third highest ruler in the kingdom.
But he wasn't interested in it, so.
Correctly so. Daniel didn't have an interest in that. Verse 17, he tells Belshazzar, you can keep your gifts or you can give them to another. I'm not interested in them. Rather, he was interested in what?
Giving God the praise.
Giving God the glory and honor, making known. In other words, Daniel was more interested in making known to Belshazzar what God had said to him. And so you come now to verses 18 and 19. And here we have a reminder from Daniel to Belshazzar. In verses 18, here is what Jehovah God had done. He tells Belshazzar plainly that how did Nebuchadnezzar receive his kingdom? How did he receive all this power, this glory? How did he come to be ruler over most of the earth? Who allowed him? Was it by his own power? Exactly, Sister Carolyn. It was God who allowed him to have this kingdom. And this is what Daniel had told Nebuchadnezzar on another occasion. You go back to chapter 2, verse 37. And he had reminded him as well on another occasion in chapter 4 that it was Jehovah who ruled in the kingdoms of men, and that he gives the kingdoms of men to whomever he will. Do you think it is the case that most people living today have forgotten this basic principle, that it is God who is in control and that it is God who rules in all the kingdoms and nations of men? Indeed. And it is foolish to credit oneself for any power one may have, because it is God who allows these things to happen. So that's what Jehovah had done. Verses 20 and 21, Daniel reminds Belshazzar of what Nebuchadnezzar had done. Now, is it true that Nebuchadnezzar had lifted himself up with pride? He was a prideful individual. But on the other hand, what did Nebuchadnezzar eventually do after he was driven from the throne? In verse 21. He lost his mind, but what did he finally come to recognize? That God rules. Exactly, Sister Gail. Verse 21 affirms, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men. And Nebuchadnezzar, when we think about the discipline that God carried out on him, it benefited Nebuchadnezzar, didn't it? Because Nebuchadnezzar allowed it to humble him. And he acknowledged the sovereignty of God. Remember when we studied Daniel 4, verses 35 through 37, the great confession that Nebuchadnezzar made, that the God of heaven is able to humble those who exalt themselves? And Nebuchadnezzar could speak forthrightly about that, could he not? Because he had experienced it firsthand. And he learned, as James writes in James chapter 4, that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And Nebuchadnezzar came to acknowledge that. Nebuchadnezzar, he learned his lesson. What had Belshazzar not done, according to verses 22 and 23? Contrasted. What makes Belshazzar's actions even worse as contrasted with Nebuchadnezzar?
He not humbled his heart, God.
He did, exactly. Nebuchadnezzar did. Belshazzar did not, and that's what makes this even worse. He knew what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Even though he knew that, and even though he knew Nebuchadnezzar had humbled himself and turned to God, Belshazzar did what? He mocked God. And he profaned the things of God arrogantly, and he worshiped the idols. And he refused to acknowledge and glorify God. And that's the height, and isn't that the height of foolish behavior, is when one decides that they can try to mock God and believe they can get away with it? That is the height of foolishness. Now, verses 24 through 29, these verses contain the final judgment. And I do want to read these verses. If someone would, read verses 24 through 29 for us. Uparson.
This is the interpretation of the matter, meaning God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed and in the balances and found wrong. Whereas your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he would be the third ruler of the kingdom.
All right, thank you, Sister Gal. So, verse 24, here Daniel gets down to business. In verse 25, we have the actual phrase that was written on the wall. And it can be pronounced many different ways. Mene, Tekel, Uparson. Verses 26 through 28 has the interpretation. And Mene. In other words, Daniel's telling Belshazzar, your kingdom's it. That's it. You've reached the end. Your kingdom's going to come to a close. It's going to end. God's going to put an end to it. And so, in other words, are we not seeing God's final judgment being pronounced on the Babylonian Empire? Indeed, we are. So, Tekel, in other words, tells Belshazzar, thou, referring to you, that would be Belshazzar, you, Belshazzar, are weighed in the balances, and you are found wanting. He had been placed upon the divine scale and fell far short of the righteous weight he needed to continue as ruler. He could not continue in the sight of God because of his wickedness. Had God given Belshazzar time to change, would that be indicative in this text? And remember, the book doesn't give us the events recording the death of Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar's coming to the throne, co-regency of the throne. So there is some time between Daniel 4 and Daniel 5. Would the text not indicate that Belshazzar had time, opportunity to change? Indeed. Though it's not specifically recorded, it is certainly implied. And he refused to change.
You have to see the power of God when they're revealed.
Indeed, he did. Indeed, he did. He saw that God's power with this miracle. Now the phrase, here's the last one, Paris. or parson. Uparson is a compound word, the conjunction u plus the plural of parson or of Paris. Daniel uses the word parson in its double sense, meaning Persians, which would be a double empire. The kingdom, he tells them specifically, was going to be given to the Medes and Persians, or the Medo-Persian Empire. And this would also correspond with the image of Nebuchadnezzar that Nebuchadnezzar saw in Daniel chapter 2. That the Medo-Persians would be that second empire to come along. And we'll see, and that imagery will also be seen again in the form of the four beasts in Daniel chapter 7. Now, with this pronouncement made, with judgment pronounced upon Belshazzar, you'd think he'd be worried, wouldn't you?
I would be.
But what does he do according to verse 29? Upon hearing these words, what does Belshazzar do? And again, this would indicate he still doesn't get the seriousness of the matter. He rewards Daniel and he goes on. And the reason being, I believe, is Belshazzar perhaps thought, well, I've got time. Even though he says the kingdom's going to come to an end, well, it's not going to come to an end anytime soon. You think that's what he was thinking? Hey, I've got time, Hey, you might say it's going to come to an end, but not while I'm on the throne. I'm going to die before it comes. I'll die before it comes to an end, and I've got plenty more time. I've got time. I'm going to continue to rule. So, Daniel, I'm going to make you the third ruler in the kingdom. I'm going to still reward you for doing this because, hey, my kingdom's not going to come to an end anytime soon. Well, that's part of the story. Now we need to know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. Look at verses 30 and 31. Here we have the finish of the Babylonian Empire. In verse number 30, what happened that very evening? That very evening, Belshazzar was slain. And you have to, he never saw it coming, did he? He never saw it coming. You know what's even sadder still? Is that in all of this, that very evening, Belshazzar passed into eternity unprepared to meet God. What's the lesson for us today about this? We know not what hour. Again, as James put it, Brother Ricky, you know not what's on the morrow. Did not Belshazzar presume to do this? Would the text not imply that Belshazzar had presumed to do certain things? Well, then tomorrow he had planned for the future rather than the here and now. Belshazzar assumed he had plenty of time, didn't he?
His tomorrow never came.
His tomorrow never came. And isn't this how a lot of people operate? About tomorrow. But again, as James puts it, you know not what's on the morrow. For what is your life? It is but a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then quickly vanisheth away. How does tomorrow often come? Are we guaranteed tomorrow? How many times have we heard it said, I'll do it tomorrow, and tomorrow has never come? How many times have you heard people say, well, and again, remember we preached a lesson on procrastination a few weeks ago, and again, I think there's an application from that we can glean here. How many times have you heard people say, well, I'll get my life right in the sight of God tomorrow? I've got time. And yet, that tomorrow never comes. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2, that now is the accepted time. When is the day of salvation? Is it tomorrow? When is it? Today. There's an old invitation song in some old, not in our songbook here, but it's in a variety of songbooks. It's titled, "Tomorrow May Be Too Late." Today is the day of salvation. Tomorrow may be too late. And one of the lines in the song has, "There's danger and death in delaying, so come without delay." And that's true, is it not? You know, Belshazzar passed into eternity unprepared to meet God. And remember, Amos said to Israel, "Prepare to meet thy God." Well, when can we prepare to meet thy God? When must we prepare to meet God? Now. You know, not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, not next year, but now. Again, there's another great invitation song, "Prepare to meet thy God." You know, how many times do people spurn the invitation and they never get it? And eventually, how many times do people spurn the invitation thinking, well, I've got plenty more time. I've got plenty more opportunities. And yet, another opportunity never comes. That's the tragedy. And I think that's the biggest tragedy of Belshazzar, is it not? Is that he presumed to do things arrogantly, confidently, without the will of God in mind. You know, when we live life, and it's okay to make plans, but when we make our plans, it has to be if the Lord wills, should it not? If the Lord willeth, I'm going to do this. We also have to make our plans in mind with the brevity of life, recognizing that, hey, I don't know how much more time I have here on this earth, because life is a vapor. And certainly, I would suggest, and certainly Belshazzar thought he had more time than just that evening. Think about it. How soon after this event took place was Belshazzar slain? Could it have been an hour? 2 hours? 3 hours? I don't know. Text doesn't tell us, but it does tell us that very evening. That's still pretty quick. Again, Belshazzar was, this moment he was here, I would snap my finger, but I'm not good at snapping fingers. But the next moment, he was gone. We need to learn the lesson about life from Belshazzar. But not only was Belshazzar slain, look at verse 31 as well. What happened to Babylon? What happened to the empire? Sister Nana?
I was going to say, surely Belshazzar had seen one kingdom fall.
Yeah.
But he didn't learn a lesson.
He didn't learn a lesson. And isn't that the problem a lot of people have today? People see the consequences that.
Other people, and I don't understand it.
I don't either. I mean, you bring out an excellent point. People see we see the actions of other people. People see, actions do have consequences, and yet they want to go right along with them. And again, as we pointed out, Sister Nana, it's obvious Belshazzar knew what God had did to Nebuchadnezzar, and it's obvious he knew that Nebuchadnezzar came to confess God, and yet he stubbornly refused to acknowledge God. And doesn't that make this even more tragic?
It makes you wonder, the kingdom didn't mean much, but it meant, I don't know, like the government today.
Yeah.
We have to be government, our people have to have a leader. And he was the leader, but it seems like he just didn't care.
Yeah, I think you make another good point. I think personally, correct me if I'm wrong, Belshazzar, like so many rulers are, was drunk on power. He liked the power, did he not?
And he liked to boast about what
He liked to boast. He liked the position. He liked having the title. Could that not describe many governmental rulers today?
Most people wait to God, power like it.
Indeed. They like the position. They like the power. Me. You're exactly right, Brother Ricky. You're exactly right. And I think that's an excellent observation, Sister Nina. I think Belshazzar was drunk on power. He didn't care what happened about the people. He just cared about himself.
Everything was going his way then,
Mm-hmm.
Thank God.
And governments would do well to remember Romans chapter 13, would they not, that they are ordained by God to keep the rule? But yet, sadly, how many governments would be guilty of not keeping the charge of their responsibilities and laid out in Romans chapter 13, 1 through 7? Go ahead. You can go ahead and say it, Brother Ricky. I think yeah. Because, and the reason being, can you imagine? Think about this. How much better would society be if governments would simply listen to God? How much better would it be? I think we know the answer to that question because it's a rhetorical question.
I think we're on the brink. I usually think positive, but it's hard. I think our president did the right thing, and I'm not belittling him at all, but maybe it can turn around, but it's been just anything goes, and it shouldn't be that way. Sin is sin, and
It is.
God is right, and if they recognize who put them in there in the first place.
Yeah. God rules in the kingdoms of men.
Or should, if they just won't let them.
Proverbs 14:34. I think this is a key passage. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And then you turn over to Psalm 33. And I think, these are principles that our nation needs to be reminded of, that governments need to be reminded of. Psalm 33 in verse 12, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. But again, we have to choose to make God. We have to choose God. And a lot of governments refuse to choose God. And we see the results, do we not, Sister Nina? We have to get God back into society. That's where he belongs. First president, and I know we're getting a little bit off here, but I think there's some great applications. George Washington, in his farewell address, said, "You can't govern a society. You can't govern a nation without God in this book." Wise man, was he not? And I have a book in my office titled "Forged in Faith." It's a history of how the United States came to be. But before they wrote the Declaration of Independence, when you look at the Continental Congress, do you realize how they started every session of the Continental Congress? What led it off? Prayer. Without fail. Prayer. Do we see that today? Nope. They do in the Senate? Well, that's good. I hope they are. But isn't that what every facet of society needs is God? God, His Word, in prayer. And as a result, though, as we have seen, when you take God out of the equation, when you live life separate and apart from God, as Belshazzar did, well, it leads to disastrous consequences. So what do we learn from this account? What causes man to be found wanting in the balances of God's righteous judgment? Well, to summarize, the answer is sin. Would that not be, That's the summation, sin. We could talk, and it's got several other applications from the text. Irreverence for God, the profaning of the things of God, failing to fear God and to reverence God, false religion, idolatry, pride and arrogance, and a refusal to practice righteousness, a refusal to submit to the righteousness of God causes one to be found weighed in the balances and found wanting. The applications of this principle are numerous. And that's what leads to ruin, not just for individuals, but to nations. As Belshazzar found out the hard way. And so as we have studied this morning, Daniel 5 and this principle of being weighed in the balances and found wanting is a clear declaration that man cannot live and conduct himself in any way he so chooses and escape the notice and judgments of God. We're going to give an account to God. It teaches us the futility of living a life unto self and fulfilling selfish desires of living such a life, as Belshazzar found out. But it does also teach us the necessity of yielding our lives to God in all things, so that when God weighs us in His with the balances of judgment, we will not be found ourselves wanting in the sight of God, because we will have been doers of righteousness and therefore accepted by God.